A 10-year-old boy walked miles through a Montana snowstorm carrying nothing but his dead father's Harley key when he stepped into a lonely highway truck stop where 200 Hells Angels were waiting out the weather and told them he wanted to sell his dad's bike to buy his mother's heart medicine. The entire diner went silent. The club president's face changed the moment he heard the boy's last name. What he said next made hardened bikers stare down at their coffee so no one would see their eyes. And before the snow stopped falling, 200 roaring engines were headed toward a frozen trailer park at the edge of town. What they did when they found that old Harley sitting in a lean-to shed behind the boy's home changed his life forever. If you believe no child should have to sell their father's memory just to keep their mother alive, stay with this story. Tap subscribe to Ride with the Gentle Biker family and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Small town, big city, living room TV, or phone in your hand. Now, let's go back to the beginning of Ronan's walk through the snow. On a grey Montana afternoon, when the sky hung low like a heavy lid over the world, a 10-year-old boy pushed open the door of a highway truck stop diner. Snow followed him in, shaking off his shoulders in tiny white explosions. His winter coat was 2 sizes too big. His boots were cracked. His fingers were bare and red from the cold. Every head in that diner turned. Coffee cups paused halfway to lips. Forks stopped mid-air. Conversations died in the space of a heartbeat. Even the jukebox seemed to dim. In that boy's right hand, gripped so tight the knuckles had gone white, was a single Harley-Davidson key. Metal worn shiny from years on a keyring that no longer existed. He didn't look around the room. He didn't scan, didn't hesitate. He walked straight toward one table in the back, where black leather vests hung off chairbacks and full-sleeve tattoos spilled down forearms like inked rivers. The men at that table looked exactly like the warnings you give kids. Slicked back hair, heavy beards, skull ink on biceps, leather vests shouting Hell's Angels across the back. At the center of them sat their president, a broad-shouldered man they called Bear. His vest was sleeveless, his arms a collage of stories in black and color. On his left arm, a skull tattoo watched the room with hollow eyes. Bear had been laughing at some old road joke, but the sound died in his throat when he saw the boy. Something about the way the kid's shoulders were set, the way his jaw trembled but his feet didn't turn around, hit him right in the chest. Bear knew that walk. It was the walk of someone who had already lost too much and was still somehow bracing to lose more. It was the walk of a person who'd run out of doors to knock on. Ronan stopped at the edge of the table, close enough now for Bear to see the raw, wind-burned skin on his cheeks and the way his fingers shook around the key. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Bikers who had ridden through gunfire and storms and years on the road sat perfectly still, watching a child fight to pull words up past his fear. The waitress stood frozen with a coffee pot in her hand. The cook leaned out of the pass-through window, grease-stained towel over his shoulder. The whole diner seemed to lean toward the boy. Ronan swallowed hard. The room blurred slightly. The long walk through the snow had left a ringing in his ears and a slow, heavy ache in his legs. He could still feel the sting of the wind on his face, the bite of ice through thin socks. He thought of his mother lying on the worn couch at home, one hand pressed to her chest, breathing in shallow, careful sips like each breath cost money. He thought of the pink notice on the trailer door. He thought of the shed behind the trailer, the one place he didn't go, because that was where his father still lived, in the smell of oil and leather and the silent waiting Harley. His dad had died a year ago in a logging accident, a life taken in one bad moment of falling timber. The world hadn't stopped. Bills kept coming. The Harley had stayed under its tarp, the last loud thing in a life that had gone quiet. Now the world was demanding payment again. Hospitals calling, finance companies threatening, the landlord taping that one final notice, the kind printed in thick, unforgiving letters. Ronan had run out of choices. All that was left was this key, this machine, this echo of the man who used to pick him up with sawdust still in his beard, who smelled like sweat and pine and gasoline and laughter. He lifted his eyes to Bear. The president saw fear there, but also something else. something stubborn, something that looked too much like the kind of courage you shouldn't have to have at 10 years old. Ronan's voice came out small at first, barely more than a whisper. "This was my dad's Harley," he said, the words catching on the word dad like it had sharp edges. "He snorts. He used to ride with you." Around the table, a few men shifted, eyes tightened. One or two looked automatically toward Bear, like they were silently asking, "Do you know this kid? Do you know this story?" A memory stirred at the back of Bear's mind. A younger man with the same grey-blue eyes, laughing at a bonfire, riding hard on a mountain road, promising he'd settle down one day. But Bear stayed quiet. He knew if he spoke too soon, he might scare the boy off. Right now, the most important thing was letting Ronan get the rest of the words out. Ronan swallowed again, fingers curling tighter around the key until it bit into his palm. "My mum's real sick," he said. "She's got a heart thing. The hospital's going to stop her medicine. And the man on the phone said they're going to take our trailer." The words tumbled out now, gaining speed. Like once he broke the dam, he couldn't hold anything back. "This is all we got left that's worth anything. My dad's bike. It's in the shed. I know where the title is. I can get it. I ain't trying to cheat you. If I pay the hospital and the man on the phone and the landlord, maybe they'll let Mom keep her medicine. Maybe they won't make us leave. Can you buy his bike so I can pay them, please? I don't know what else to do." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, packed with the weight of every unpaid bill, every late-night phone call, every little boy who'd been told in one way or another that money mattered more than his mother's heartbeat. Bear felt something hot rise in his throat, a burn that had nothing to do with the black coffee in front of him. This was a world he knew too well. A kid backed into a corner by people who would never see his face, only his balance do. He looked down at the key, at the scratched metal and the faint grease still clinging to its grooves. Then he looked back into Ronan's eyes and knew with absolute certainty that whatever today cost, that boy wasn't walking back out into the snow alone. Bear leaned back in his chair, the old wood creaking under his weight, and let out a slow breath. Around him, the other angels watched, their tattoos and leather suddenly feeling less like armor and more like a responsibility. "What's your name, kid?" Bear asked, his voice low and steady, the kind of calm that made people stop fidgeting and listen. Clear's throat. "Ronan," the boy said, Ronan Hayes. A biker 2 seats down stiffened almost imperceptibly at the last name. Hayes. There it was. The echo. The puzzle piece Bear had been reaching for in his memory slid into place. Ronan's father had ridden with them once years ago before he left the club to try his hand at the kind of quiet life you only see on postcards. A wife, a kid, a job in the woods cutting trees instead of cutting miles. Bear remembered the last handshake, the promise to come back around someday. The way the man had grinned and said, "You know where to find me if you ever need a place to crash." Now his kid was standing here asking for help to keep a roof over his head. The world had a twisted sense of humor. "Ronan," Bear repeated. "You walked here." Ronan nodded. "From the trailer park," he said, "out past the grain silos. I cut across the fields till I hit the road." Bear glanced toward the window. The snow was still falling in thick, lazy sheets, blurring the trucks and bikes outside into soft grey shapes. That walk in this weather wasn't just brave, it was desperate. "How long's your mom been sick?" Bear asked. Ronan shifted, the oversized coat rustling around him. "A while," he said. "She gets tired easy. Then her chest hurts. The doctor gave her pills, but said she needs, procedures." The word sounded strange coming from a child's mouth, like it didn't quite fit. "They cost a lot," Ronan continued. "We paid what we could. Then they started sending papers, calling. Mum cries after the calls. She tries to do it when she thinks I'm sleeping." In Bear's mind, the diner walls fell away, and he saw it. A narrow trailer living room, a sagging couch, a woman with tired eyes listening to a stranger tell her what her life was worth in monthly installments. "And this finance company?" Bear asked quietly. "You mentioned a man on the phone." Ronan nodded again. He said my dad took a loan before the tree fell for the truck and some other stuff. He said if we don't pay, they'll take anything they can. The bike, the trailer, even the truck. If Mum can't prove it's paid off. Each word layered another brick onto the wall, closing in around this child. Hospital billing finance company, landlord. 3 heads on the same monster. There's a paper on the door, Ronan added. Red letters. Says we got to pay by the end of the week, or they'll throw us out. It's real cold at night now. Bear didn't need Ronan to spell out what being thrown out meant. He'd ridden past that trailer park. He'd seen the plumes of breath in the air, the thin windows taped up with plastic, the kids waiting for late buses with no hats. He let the silence stretch just long enough to feel the weight of it settle over every man at the table. Every one of them had been poor. Everyone had known the taste of fear when you realize the world doesn't care if you freeze. Bear looked around at his brothers. No one smiled now. No one looked away. Their expressions were calm, but there was a new sharpness in their eyes, the kind of focus that usually showed up before a long ride or a hard conversation. Ronan took the silence as judgment and rushed in to fill it. I know the bike's worth a lot, he said. Dad kept it nice. I can clean it up. I know where the title is. I ain't trying to cheat you. If I pay the hospital and the man on the phone and the landlord, maybe they'll let Mom keep her medicine. Maybe they won't make us leave. Bear's chest tightened. This child was talking like a man twice his age and 3 times his burden, dividing imaginary numbers in his head, trying to stretch dollars he didn't even have yet. Somewhere deep inside, an old anger woke up. Not the wild, useless kind that starts bar fights, but the cold, focused anger that asks who decided it was acceptable to scare children like this. Bear leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table. The skull tattoo on his bicep caught the light, its empty eyes suddenly seeming to glare at an enemy that wasn't in the room. Ronan, look at me, he said. The boy's eyes came up. They were the same grey-blue his father had carried, but now they held a question. Are you going to turn me away too? You came here, Bear said slowly, to sell your dad's Harley, so you can buy your mom more time. That right? Ronan nodded. Yes, sir. Bear nodded back like they'd just agreed on something important. Okay, Bear said. Here's what's going to happen next. Around the table, backs straightened by instinct. These men were used to taking orders on the road, used to the way a single sentence from their president could turn a lazy afternoon into a mission. First, Bear said, you're going to sit down and warm up, hands around a hot mug. Maybe a burger if you can handle one. Ronan opened his mouth to protest. He hadn't brought money for food, but Bear was already shaking his head. Don't worry about the bill, Bear added. We got that. That small promise, easily made, loosened something in the boy's shoulders. For the first time since he'd walked in, Ronan looked less like someone braced for impact and more like a kid who might be allowed to rest. Son, Bear continued, you're going to tell me everything. Names, numbers, what hospital, what finance company, what landlord, every paper on your table at home. Ronan hesitated, then nodded slowly. The idea of saying it all out loud again hurt, but there was something about the way Bear spoke, calm, steady, no panic, that made it feel possible. And third, Bear said, his voice dropping a shade lower, you're not selling your dad's Harley. Ronan blinked, confused. For a second, he thought he'd misheard that maybe his ears were still ringing from the wind howling past them on the walk over. But I have to, he said. It's the only thing worth. Bear cut him off with a small wave of his hand. Not rude, just final. You're not selling that bike, Bear repeated. That bike is part of your dad, part of you. Parts like that don't go on auction. Ronan shook his head, panic fluttering back up. Then I got nothing, he said. They're going to take Mum's pills. They're going to. Bear leaned in, eyes holding the boy's like a steadying hand on a shoulder. Listen to me, Ronan, he said. You came to the right place. Your dad rode with us. That makes you family in our book. And family doesn't get left to freeze while strangers count their money. Around the table, a few heads nodded. No speeches, no applause, just quiet agreement, the kind that actually means something. You asked if we'd buy your dad's Harley, Bear went on. We're going to do something better. We are going to make sure your mom gets her medicine. We are going to make sure nobody throws you out of that trailer into the snow. We are going to make sure those people learn there's a line they don't get to cross. Ronan stared at him, not quite understanding how words could possibly bend bills and pass due notices. But there was a steadiness in Bear's tone, a certainty he'd never heard on the other end of a phone call. But you got to promise me something too, Bear added. Ronan swallowed. What? You let us handle the fight, Bear said. You're 10. Your job is to be with your mum, to tell her we're coming, and to keep that key safe. Think you can do that? Ronan looked down at the Harley key in his hand. For the first time today, it didn't feel like a bill of sale. It felt like what it had always been, a connection, a link in a chain that didn't end just because someone was buried. He closed his fingers around it and nodded. Yes, sir. Bear pushed his chair back and stood. The skull on his bicep flexed with the motion, inked teeth gritting in silent agreement. Finish that story for me over a burger, Bear said. Then we're going for a ride. Ronan blinked. A ride? Bear's mouth twitched, the closest thing to a smile his face managed when he was working through anger. You said the trailer park's past the silos, right? Road's not great in this weather. Good thing there will be about 200 of us lighting it up. Around the diner, chairs scraped back. The quiet was replaced by the clink of keys, the rustle of leather, the low murmur of men checking on gas and gear. A few non-biker customers stared, unsure whether to be afraid or relieved. They'd find out soon enough. When 200 Hells Angels roared down that snowy road behind a 10-year-old boy and his mother's last hope, nobody in that town would ever mistake them for a threat again. Before we follow those engines into the snow, take a second and think about this boy's walk. If you've ever felt like Ronan doing adult math in a child's head, hit subscribe and stay with our gentle biker family and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Small town, big city, living room TV, or a phone in a quiet kitchen. We'd love to know who's riding along with us tonight. When Bear stepped out of the diner, the cold hit him like a wall. Snowflakes swirled under the yellow parking lot lights, catching in his beard, melting on the leather of his sleeveless vest. He heard engines clearing their throats one by one, that familiar rolling thunder that had followed him most of his life. Tonight, it sounded different. Tonight, it sounded like a promise. Ronan stood beside him, small and bundled in his oversized coat, breath puffing out in quick white clouds. Bear shrugged out one arm and held out a heavy leather jacket lined with fleece, a spare he kept strapped to his bike for cold snaps like this. Arms in, Bear said. His voice was gruff, but his hands were careful as he helped the boy into the jacket, zipping it up to his chin. Can't have you freezing before we even get there. Ronan slid his arms through, swallowed by the weight and warmth. For a second, he let his face sink into the collar, inhaling the smell of leather, engine oil, and the faint, sharp note of cold air. It smelled like the stories his dad used to tell, like long roads and loud nights and never being alone. Bear swung a leg over his Harley and tapped the seat behind him. Climb on, Ronan. You ride with me. The boy hesitated only a moment before obeying. Small hands wrapping around Bear's middle, fingers digging into the leather like he was afraid the whole world might jerk away if he let go. Around them, bikes rumbled to life. Headlights cut through the curtain of snow, lining up in a staggered formation that filled the highway lanes and spilled into the truck lot. 200 engines coughing and roaring became one long, low growl that rolled out across the frozen fields. Bear looked down the line, eyes tracing over every black sleeveless vest, every set of tattooed arms, every skull inked into skin. These were men who had done things they weren't proud of and things they'd never talk about. But they were also men who understood what it meant to owe someone more than money. He raised his hand, 2 fingers in the air, the old signal. Conversations died. Helmets settled. The only sound was the steady, hungry purr of 200 Harleys waiting for a direction. "We're riding to the trailer park, past the silos," Bear called over the noise, voice carrying easily. "We escort Ronan home. We see his mum, and then we go to work. No yelling, no games. We do this clean." A few heads nodded. They understood. They didn't need to puff their chests. Their presence was its own kind of volume. "Hospital, finance company, landlord," Bear added. "We're going to pay what needs paying and make sure they understand something they should have known already." One of the older bikers, a man with white in his beard and a skull tattoo that had faded with decades, lifted his chin. "What's that?" Bear looked down at Ronan's gloved hands gripping his vest. "That behind every bill is a heartbeat," he said. "And we just met this one in person." The engines rose in answer, a deep rolling rumble that vibrated through the asphalt. Bear twisted the throttle, felt the machine shudder under him like a warhorse. Then, without another word, he pulled out of the lot. 200 Hell's Angels fell in behind him, a river of headlights pouring into the snow-dark highway. Ronan watched the world blur past in streaks of white and grey. The wind clawed at his cheeks, but Bear's back blocked the worst of it. For the first time in months, Ronan wasn't walking somewhere alone. He was being carried. The difference sank into him with every mile. As they passed the grain silos, Ronan felt his stomach knot. The closer they got to the trailer park, the more real everything became. He'd left his mother with a blanket pulled up to her chin, telling her he'd be back soon. He hadn't said where he was going. Clear's throat. What if she woke up scared? What if she got worse while he was gone? Bear must have felt the boy tense because he reached down and patted the small hands at his waist. "She's still breathing," he called over his shoulder. "We're moving faster than any phone call. Remember that." They rolled into the trailer park, like a storm with its own gravity. Engines idled low as they turned between rows of narrow homes. Some windows glowing weakly, others dark. Curtains twitched, doors cracked open. People stepped out onto icy porches, blinking at the sight of so much leather and chrome filling their street. To neighbors who had only ever seen bikers on TV, it might have looked like trouble arriving. But to Ronan, sitting on Bear's bike with the Harley key pressed into his palm, it felt like the world was finally paying attention. Bear cut his engine in front of a small weather-beaten trailer with plastic film taped over one of the windows. The red eviction notice fluttered on the door in the wind like a small angry flag. He felt his jaw tighten. "This the place?" he asked. Ronan nodded, throat too tight to speak. Bear eased the boy down off the bike, then followed him up the short, creaking steps. Two of the bikers peeled off to stand on either side of the yard, calm centuries in sleeveless vests, their tattooed arms crossed, breath fogging in the cold. Ronan opened the door slowly. Warm, stale air washed over them, carrying the smell of canned soup, old carpet, and something sharper. The metallic medicinal scent of pills and worry. "Mom!" Ronan called, voice small in the confined space. "It's me." A woman on the couch stirred. She was younger than Bear had expected, probably not much past 30, but illness had carved years into her face. There were shadows under her eyes that no amount of sleep would erase, and a hint of blue at her lips that made Bear's chest ache. She pushed herself up on one elbow, hand automatically going to her chest. "Ronan," she began, and then she saw the silhouette filling the doorway behind him. "It's okay, Mom," Ronan rushed to say, moving closer. "This is Bear." He knew Dad and some of his friends. Bear stepped inside, careful to move slowly. "Ma'am," he said, inclining his head. "Name's Bear. Your husband rode with us back in the day." Her gaze flickered, recognition fighting with confusion. "You're from the club," she said softly. "He used to talk about you like you were brothers." "We were," Bear replied. "Still are." He glanced around the small living room, peeling linoleum, a coffee table buried in envelopes, pill bottles lined up in a neat, desperate row, "Which is why we're here." She followed his eyes and flushed faintly, as if ashamed of the stacked debt spilling across the table. Look, she began, pushing herself a little more upright. If Ronan came to you asking for money, he came asking to sell his dad's Harley, Bear said gently. To pay for your medicine and to keep that paper from turning into someone knocking with a clipboard. Her hand flew to her mouth. Tears sprang up fast, fueled by equal parts anger and love. He did what? She whispered. He walked through a storm to get to us, Bear said. That tells me two things. One, he's stubborn. Two, you're out of options you should never have had to face in the first place. She closed her eyes, a tear slipping free. We're fine, she tried, reflexive pride kicking in. We'll figure it out. You don't need to, Mom. Bear interrupted softly. You are not fine. You're sick. You're behind. And the people calling your house do not care that your son is 10 and walking through snow to strangers. We do. The words landed with a weight that went deeper than any bill. For a moment, the room held only the sound of her uneven breathing and Ronan's quiet sniffle. What are you going to do? She asked finally, voice fragile as thin ice. Bear looked at Ronan, then back at her. We're going to take those papers, he said, nodding toward the table. And we're going to visit some folks, hospital first, then the finance company, then your landlord. We'll talk their language, cards, cash, contracts, but we'll also explain something they seem to forget. Which is, she asked, that behind every account number is a kitchen table just like this one, Bear said. With a kid just like Ronan wondering how many grown-ups have to say no before somebody finally shows up and says enough. She stared at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity and finding none. Outside, engines idled, a low, constant heartbeat under their conversation. I can't pay you back, she whispered. Bear shook his head. You already did, he said. Your husband did when he rode with us, when he had our backs. This is us having yours. That's how family works. The word family did something to her. It flickered across her features like an old photograph catching the light. Slowly, she nodded. Bear turned to Ronan. You stay here with your mum, he said. You show her that key. You tell her we're taking a ride for her. You hear? Ronan swallowed hard and nodded. His fingers found the key in his pocket, wrapping around it like a lifeline. 15 minutes later, Bear strode into the hospital's main lobby with a folder full of crumpled bills tucked under his arm and 3 bikers at his back. They didn't spread out or swagger. They walked in a straight line, tattoos and sleeveless vests stark against the sterile white walls. Nurses glanced up, eyes widening for a second before realizing these men were not here to cause trouble. Their faces were too calm, too resolved, a different kind of emergency. Bear stepped up to the billing window where a woman behind thick glass sat typing numbers into a screen. Can I help you? She asked. Yes, ma'am, Bear said. He slid the folder through the slot. We're here about these. She opened the folder, flipping through the stack. Mrs. Hayes, she read you family. You could say that, Bear replied. We're the part of her husband's family that rides on 2 wheels. She owes a significant amount, the woman said, businesslike. Payment plans. Bear held up a hand, not rudely. Just enough to pause the script. We're not here to argue about the past. He said. We're here to pay it, and we're here to make sure her treatment doesn't stop because she can't keep up with whatever number that computer likes. He reached back and took a battered leather wallet from one of his brothers, then another. Credit cards were fanned out on the counter, edges worn from years of gas stations and motel. Run however many of these you have to, he said. Split it up. Call whoever you have to call, but when we leave, I want her account at 0 and a note in there that says her medication doesn't stop because her husband died under a tree. The woman blinked, thrown off balance by the reversal. She was used to conflict, to tears, to pleading. She was not used to tattooed men calmly offering to bleed their cards dry for someone they didn't share a last name with. I'll have to get my supervisor, she said. That's fine, Bear replied. We're not going anywhere. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't pound on the glass. They simply stood there. A solid wall of leather and ink and quiet determination. People in the waiting area watched openly now, curiosity outweighing caution. Within an hour, they had paid off the past due balance, locked in a charity program for future treatments, and made sure every note in that file reminded anyone who opened it that the patient had a support system, a big, loud one. The finance company was next. Their office was in a low-strip mall on the edge of town, the kind of place where misery got printed on letterhead and mailed out in window envelopes. When 24 Harleys rumbled into the lot, blinds snapped shut up and down the row of windows. Bear walked in with a smaller crew this time, leaving the rest outside in a neat line. He wanted a show of force, not a scene. "We're here about the Hayes account," Bear said. 20 minutes later, they were sitting across from a man in a cheap tie who smelled faintly of cologne and old paper. The man smiled with his mouth, but not his eyes. "Mr. Hayes unfortunately passed," the man said, tapping a folder. "But the debt remains. These are legal agreements. I'm afraid there's only so much we can do." Bear leaned back, letting the chair creak. "Funny," he said mildly, "because from where I sit, there's quite a bit you can do. You can stop calling a 10-year-old's house at dinner time like a wolf circling a chicken coop. You can stop threatening to take the last thing he has of his father. And you can show a little mercy in a town where everyone knows everyone." The man's smile thinned. "Sir, I don't appreciate being—" "You don't have to appreciate it," Bear said. His voice didn't rise, but the air in the room shifted. "You just have to listen." He laid a cashier's check on the desk, the numbers neat and uncompromising. "This clears the principal," he said. "Not the interest. The principal. You forgive the rest. You close the account, and you stop using a dead man's truck and bike as leverage against his widow and kid. That's our offer." The man sputtered. "That's highly irregular," he protested. "So, as a child walking through a storm to sell his father's Harley to pay you," Bear replied. "Yet, here we are." Through the blinds, the man could see the silhouettes of bikers waiting outside, arms crossed, breath fogging, their patience long but not endless. They weren't pacing or pounding. They were simply there, a living reminder that this family was no longer alone in the conversation. In the end, numbers bent faster than pride. The check was accepted. The balance was adjusted. The calls would stop. The landlord was last. His office was a cramped room near the entrance to the trailer park, walls lined with cheap paneling and a bulletin board full of rules. Bear walked in with just one other man this time, leaving the bikes idling at the edge of the lot. "You posted a final notice on the Hayes trailer," Bear said. "We're here about that." The landlord frowned. "They're months behind," he said. "I've got my own mortgage. If I make exceptions—" Bear held up a hand again, that same small, steady gesture. "We're not asking for an exception," he said. "We're asking for a receipt." He placed an envelope on the desk. The landlord opened it, eyes widening at the stack of rent money inside. "Past due, plus several months ahead." "That covers what they owe," Bear said. "And that buys them breathing room. You'll give them a written agreement that as long as they keep up from here, nobody's posting anything on that door again without talking to us first." The landlord looked from the envelope to Bear's face, to the line of bikes visible through the small office window, exhaust curling in the cold. "You some kind of charity?" he asked, suspicious. Bear shook his head. "No," he said. "We're family. Big one." The landlord slowly nodded. He saw the writing on the wall, and for once it wasn't red. "You'll tell them they're safe?" he asked. "You'll tell them," Bear corrected gently, standing. "And we'll be there to make sure they believe you." By the time the snow finally began to lighten, the hospital had stopped its calls. The finance company had closed its file, and the landlord had traded his eviction notice for a handshake. The system that had been leaning hard on a sick woman and her boy suddenly found itself facing something it didn't quite know how to categorize. A wall of leather and loyalty and quiet, unshakable resolve. And all of it had started with a child in a too-big coat, walking through the storm with a Harley key pressed into his palm. By the time Bear's bike rolled back into the trailer park, The snow had softened into a quiet drift, the kind that made the world feel muffled and small. The red notice on the Hayes trailer door still fluttered in the wind, but its power was already gone. It just didn't know it yet. Ronan waited on the steps, the Harley key in his fist, his breath fogging the air. Every minute since Bear had left had stretched longer than the last. When he heard the first engine, he didn't just hear noise. He heard an answer. Headlights swept across the snow-packed street again, but this time they weren't arriving to fight. They were coming home from one. 24 bikes peeled off to park down the row, giving Bear room to pull up right in front of the trailer. He cut the engine and climbed the steps. "How's Mom?" he asked. "She's tired," Ronan said. "But she's awake. She kept asking if you were really coming back." Bear huffed a soft breath that might have been a laugh if the day had been lighter. "We said we would," he replied. And we did. He reached past the angry red paper on the door, pinched it free from the tape, folded it twice, and tucked it into his vest pocket. "Won't be needing this anymore," he added. Inside, the living room looked exactly as they'd left it. Same couch, same flickering lamp, same stack of bills on the coffee table. But the air felt different. Less like a trap, more like a room waiting for news. Ronan's mother sat propped against a pillow, blanket pulled around her shoulders. "Well," she asked, skipping past every polite word. "What did they say?" Bear sat on the edge of a worn armchair across from her, resting his forearms on his knees. "The hospital," he began, "is paid up on what you owed. Every past due, you're enrolled in a program that keeps your treatment going. They have it in writing that they don't pull your meds because you're short on a bill." "Paid," she echoed. "Paid," Bear confirmed. "We saw the screen change from red to 0. We don't leave until we see the numbers. The finance company," Bear continued, "took a check for what your husband actually borrowed, not the pile of interest they stacked on top. The rest, they're writing it off. The account's closed. No more calls. No more letters. They don't go near your trailer, your truck, or that bike. And your landlord," Bear said, "has every cent you owed him and a cushion for the next few months. You've got a signed agreement that as long as you keep current from here on out, nobody posts anything on that door without talking to us first." For a heartbeat, the room went silent. Then Ronan's mother covered her face with both hands. Her shoulders shook once, twice, as if something inside her had finally given up fighting. Ronan panicked at the first sob. Mom, it's okay. They fixed it. They fixed everything." Bear watched her cry, not flinching, not looking away. He'd seen enough grief to know that sometimes tears weren't just for what had gone wrong. But for the first time, something went right. When she finally lowered her hands, her eyes were wet but clear. "Why?" she asked. "Why would you do all that for us?" Bear glanced at Ronan, then back at her. "Because your husband once stood next to us when things were ugly," he said. "Because he rode with our patch and had our backs. Because he walked away from this life to come home to you and this boy. And that was the bravest thing I ever saw him do. And because no 10-year-old should have to choose between his mother's heartbeat and his father's motorcycle. He always said, if anything happened to him, I should call the club," she said. "I thought he was joking. I didn't want to drag you into our mess. I didn't want my son around." She glanced at the tattoos, the leather, the skull ink. "Around men like us." Bear finished without offense. "I get it. World has a way of telling our story for us. Loud bikes, loud rumors. Thing is, ma'am, your boy already came to us. Walked through snow to do it. Mess and all. So, here we are outside. The sound of boots on metal steps and low voices filtered through the thin walls. The other bikers weren't just waiting, they were moving. "What are they doing out there?" Ronan asked. Bear's mouth twitched into the faintest suggestion of a smile. "Stalking your kitchen," he said. "One crew hit the grocery store while we were at the hospital. You're about to be sick of the sight of canned soup and pasta boxes. Groceries, a space heater, a new blanket. Every knock on the door brought something that made breathing easier instead of harder. One biker tapped a photo of Ronan's dad on the wall and said simply, He was a good man, before stepping back out into the cold. The door, once a gateway for fear, became a revolving line of quiet help. "There's one more thing," Bear said. "Something we need to talk about." Ronan's hand flew to his pocket. "The bike," he said. Bear nodded. "The bike. It's sitting in that shed out back, gathering dust and memories. You came to sell it. We're not letting you, but we're also not leaving it to rot." He jerked his chin toward the back door. "Come on, both of you, if you can manage it." Ronan's mother leaned on his shoulder as they stepped into the cold. The shed loomed at the edge of the small yard, roof sagging under snow. Two bikers had already cleared a path. Inside, the Harley waited under its grey tarp, the outline of its tank and handlebars familiar, even through the dust. The air smelled like oil and old wood, and a quiet sort of reverence. "Go ahead," Bear said to Ronan. "Do the honours." Ronan grabbed the edge of the tarp and tugged. Dust puffed up as the cover slid back, revealing the bike his father had polished 100 times. Chrome dulled but not gone, paint faded but still clinging to colour. His mother sucked in a sharp breath, seeing not just metal, but years. Bear ran a calloused hand along the handlebars, fingers tracing the worn grips like he was greeting an old friend. "She's still got good bones," he murmured. "Just needs love and parts." He turned to Ronan and his mother. "Here's what we're going to do. We're taking this bike back to our clubhouse. We're going to strip her down, clean her up, put her back together better than new. When we're done, she'll be what your husband always meant her to be." "What's that?" Ronan asked. "A promise that nobody gets forgotten," Bear replied. "We'll put his name on the wall above her. Maybe a plate with his dates. People will see it when they walk in. They'll know he was one of us. They'll know you and Ronan are too." He gently tapped the Harley key in Ronan's hand. "This stays with you. You ever need us again, you hold on to this and remember we're one phone call and a few miles away. When you're old enough and your mum's strong enough to yell at you for going too fast, we'll see about putting you in that seat." Ronan blinked hard. "You mean I'll still get to see it?" "You'll see it more than we do," Bear said. "We'll bring you out to the clubhouse. You'll sit on it. Talk to your old man if you want. Some ghosts listen better when you're eye to eye." His mother shook her head slowly, awe softening the tired lines of her face. "You're turning his bike into a memorial," she said. "Into a reminder," Bear corrected. "That he chose you, that he left our road to build this little life, no matter how hard it got. And that when the world tried to crush what he left behind, somebody pushed back." Outside the shed, engines rumbled softly, patient and steady. In the cold Montana night, a boy, his mother, and a circle of leather-clad giants stood around an old Harley that was about to become something bigger than metal and gasoline. The bills were handled, the roof was safe, the medicine would keep coming. But it was this, the feeling that his father's story wasn't over, that it would keep echoing every time those engines started, that settled deepest into Ronan's bones. For the first time in a long time, the future didn't look like a blank, dark road. It looked like a ride he wouldn't have to take alone. Years have a way of slipping by quietly when you're not counting them in overdue notices. Winters came and went in that Montana trailer park. The snow still fell. The silos still stood. The wind still found every crack in every wall. But inside one narrow home at the end of a rooted lane, the story changed. Ronan grew. The too big winter coat became just right, then too small. His boots were replaced not with charity cast-offs, but with pairs his mother picked out in stores without doing the math on a scrap of paper first. His mother's cheeks rounded out. The blue at her lips faded. There were still bad days, still doctor visits, still pill bottles lined up on the counter. But her heartbeat was no longer a billable emergency. It was just life. On the wall above the couch, a new frame appeared. Inside it, printed on glossy paper, was a photograph. Ronan, at 12, standing in front of a black Harley on a raised platform at the Hells Angels clubhouse, one hand on the handlebar, Bear's massive arms slung around his shoulders. Above the bike, a polished plaque read, Cade Hayes, brother, rider, father, never forgotten. The old Harley shone brighter than it ever had in that sagging shed. Chrome gleamed. Paint glowed under soft spotlights. The engine didn't run often anymore, but when it did, the sound filled the clubhouse with something that wasn't quite sadness and wasn't quite joy. Ronan visited that bike often on birthdays, on the anniversary of the logging accident, on random Tuesdays when school felt too loud and the world felt too big. He'd sit on the worn leather seat, hands on the grips the way his father's had been, and talk in a low voice. Sometimes he talked about grades and friends, sometimes about fear, sometimes about the day he'd walked into that diner with a key in his bare hand and asked a room full of strangers to choose his mother's life over his father's memory. The strange thing was the more he talked, the less alone those memories felt. The Hells Angels didn't just show up once and vanish. They folded themselves into the small routines of Ronan's life the way family does. On school concert nights, 3 or 4 leather vests would take up an entire row in the back of the auditorium, their skull tattoos at odds with the paper decorations on the walls. They sat through squeaky clarinets and off-key choirs like they were watching the most important show on earth. When Ronan had a science project due, someone showed up with scrap metal and tools and turned a simple assignment into a working model that impressed his teacher and terrified the janitor. On the worst health days, when his mother's energy dipped and old fears pressed at the door, a bike would rumble up outside. A familiar knock would sound. Someone would drop off groceries or sit at the table with her while Ronan did homework in the next room. The low murmur of their voices a steadying sound. Every year on the same winter weekend, the memorial ride rolled out. 200 bikes lined up on a ploughed highway, engines idling in the cold, exhaust curling like breath from a sleeping giant. At the front bare. Beside him now, not on the back, was Ronan on a smaller machine they'd built together over summers and scraped knuckles. His mother would stand at the edge of the clubhouse lot, bundled in a thick coat, watching them start. Bear always rolled by slow enough to tip his head to her. Ronan always lifted a hand in a wave that said, "I'm okay, you're okay." We made it another year. The ride would take them past the old trailer park, past the spot where Ronan had once stood in the snow, listening to engines like they were thunder from some other life. Neighbors would come out to watch the river of leather and chrome pass, some with hands shading their eyes, some with small smiles, some with tears they didn't bother to wipe away. At the end of the ride, back at the clubhouse, everyone would file past Cade's Harley. Some bikers would rest their hand on the tank for a heartbeat. Some would tap the plaque with 2 fingers. Ronan always did both. By then, the Harley key didn't feel like a choice anymore. It felt like a bridge. He still carried it in his pocket, the metal warmed by his palm. When life got loud, college brochures, job applications, grown-up decisions crowding the edges of his vision, he'd roll it between his fingers and feel the weight of that day in the diner. There had been a time when he thought heroes only lived in comic books and on screens, people in costumes who flew and fought with impossible strength. He'd learned better in a snowstorm. Heroes, he realized, were not always clean-cut and smiling. Sometimes they had lines on their faces from sun and wind. Sometimes their hands were calloused and stained and shook a little when they paid off someone else's debt. Sometimes they wore leather vests and skull tattoos and rode machines loud enough to make windows rattle. Years later, sitting on a bench beside his father's memorial bike, Ronan tried to put it into words for himself and for anyone who might be listening. His dad, his mum, the boy he used to be, walking alone through snow. "Heroes don't always wear capes," he murmured, watching the clubhouse doors swing open to let in another gust of cold air and laughter. "Sometimes they wear leather." He thought about the hospital clerk who'd watched numbers on a screen turn from red to 0 because a line of bikers refused to leave. He thought about the finance man who'd learned that a balance sheet could be rewritten with compassion. He thought about the landlord who, after shaking Bear's hand, had started quietly giving a little more leeway to anyone with a sick spouse. None of those people had changed the world, but they had changed his family, Ronan said softly, fingers curled around the key. is who shows up. Not just when the sun is out, not just when the bills are paid and the fridge is full. Family is who shows up when the phone won't stop ringing, and the red letters on the door make your stomach drop. Family is who takes that weight, looks it in the eye, and says, "You're not carrying this alone anymore." For Ronan, family had been a tired mother on a worn couch, a father who'd given up the open road for a little trailer at the edge of town, and 200 men in black vests who decided that a boy's plea was their line in the sand. The world outside the clubhouse kept spinning. Bills went out, storms rolled in, engines wore down, and were rebuilt again. Somewhere, another child was learning too early what words like balance, due, and final notice meant. But on this night in this place, the story had landed differently. A boy had walked into a diner with nothing but a key and a braking voice. He'd walked out with a wall of engines behind him, and because of that, a woman lived to see her son grow tall. A man who died under a falling tree was remembered not as a debt, but as a brother. An old Harley became a promise in chrome and steel. Maybe that's the real miracle in stories like this. Not that 200 Hell's Angels can roar down a street and make people move, but that they choose to do it for someone who cannot pay them back. For someone the world already decided was expendable. Heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear leather. And family is who shows up. If you've ever been Ronan or his mom, or someone who stepped in when the world looked away, this story is yours too. And if you're listening to this on a TV in a quiet living room or on a phone in the dark after a long day, remember, there is always someone out there with an engine warming up ready to ride for you. You might not see them yet, but they're closer than you think.